So yeah, I was cooking a few things from the book. Some of them it was very strange, very alien. So I was like, yes, that sounds completely bonkers. Let's do this.
But that's part of the charm, I think, is that it's almost an archaeological excavation of a recipe. It's kind of trying to find out what some of the meanings. I guess we'll talk about that in a bit, because with Apicius, there's kind of so much of it is left to the chef or the cook.
Yeah, that was the first thing that struck me as interesting. That it's you have a lot of freedom to maneuver around quantities and the ingredients. Hello, I'm Tom Dinas, and this is a Delicious Legacy podcast. Hope you're all safe and well. Welcome to our latest episode of Archaeogastronomical Adventures. On this episode, I am honoured to have Andrew Kendrick from University of East Anglia with me, who studied extensively about the Roman cuisine 2,000 years ago. Specifically, he investigated a lot, and he is very passionate about the famous, and some will say infamous, Gourmand Apicius. The only complete surviving cookbook we have from antiquity bears his name. Who was he? What did he do to change the course of food and gastronomy in the ancient world, and also today? Andrew's knowledge on the subject is quite vast, and some of the historical facts are very, very fascinating. Together today, we'll delve into the time of the early Roman Empire, a universe of exotic delicacies, extravagant luxuries, extreme ingredients, and impossible journeys to unearth the tastiest food of the ancient world. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. So yeah, welcome to the Delicious Legacy podcast.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Thanks for joining me on this little archaeogastronomical adventure, as I like to call them. I don't know if that's a term, but
Well, it is now.
but I like it. So how did you involved with Apicius?
Oh, it's one of these happy coincidences, really, that seems to have shaped my kind of scholarship. So I originally studied archaeology and ancient history way back in 1999, 2000, and then changed careers after that. I didn't become an archaeologist. I became an editor. And by a very roundabout route, I ended up back at university in 2016 at University of East Anglia doing an MA in creative nonfiction and biography with no intention of using ancient history or drawing on my archaeological interests. That was always just a hobby, kind of a passing interest. And that same year, I took a trip to Rome and visited an old colleague, a friend, and she took me out for dinner, and it was the most amazing meal. It was modern Roman cuisine, but it was one of these quirky family restaurants where there was no menu. The waiter came and sat at your table and explained what there was. And it was all sorts of things like horse meat and glands and bull's balls and all sorts of things like this. It was very... I'm quite an adventurous eater, but it definitely pushed me to the limit. And I started writing about this for one of my projects. I wrote an account of this, and two things clicked really, which was, well, how would this modern Roman cuisine, did it bear any relation to ancient Roman cuisine? And it started me kind of researching, well, what was ancient Roman cuisine? And you can't really go very far along that line of research without coming across Apicius, who was this, I guess I always describe him as a Roman celebrity chef.
Yeah.
And he became the focus of my attention. So I was fascinated to discover he still had a cookbook bearing his name is still in print, and we still have records of recipes attributed to him. And it became the sole project for my master's. So I ended up writing my dissertation on Apicius, not so much necessarily on Roman cuisine, but on the life of Apicius and how much we can deduce about him from his cookbook.
Yeah.
And then, one thing led to another, and that ended up being my project.
Yeah.
And over the course of it, of course, I ended up cooking his recipes, just as a way of trying to get inside
Yeah.
his mind.
How long did it took you to finish that project?
That was just for a year. That was,
Yeah.
and it ended up it was quite self-contained. It ended up being quite a short, self-contained piece of writing, kind of focusing on what we know about the end of Apicius's life, which is he lived quite a. He was a I mean, I suppose I guess we'll maybe talk about this in more detail, but I should caveat this. But there's most of what we know about Apicius is speculation and gossip, and there's questions about whether he was a real character at all.
Really?
So one of the things that one of the famous things attributed to him is that he was a very rich aristocrat, possibly in the start of the first century AD, and he famously spent all his fortune on exotic ingredients and throwing fantastic banquets and experimenting with gastronomy. And when he got down to his last 10 or 12 million sestertii, which is about $8 or $9 million in today's money, he declared that he could not live so frugally and killed himself. So that's kind of so I took that was the focus, the kind of rise and fall of Apicius.
Yeah.
And I tried to write something that might resemble a biography, kind of based on what we know. A lot of it ended up being quite speculative because we don't know a huge amount.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's so much stuff to learn and find out about the Roman Empire at that time.
Absolutely, but he's a subject very close to my heart. I do hope to go back to him as a subject. I think I just because I could spend all day writing about Roman food and talking about Roman food, especially Apician Roman food, not necessarily.
I've read your stuff, and obviously it was really nicely written and very interesting. I mean, the detail, as you said, it might not be so real, or might be a lot of elements there that they're myths, but I mean, it's so fascinating. Yeah, so many things that I didn't know. Basically, that he was friends with the emperors. The things that struck me firstly was that you called him the worst of all gourmands. I kind of laughed with that line. Why the worst?
Just because I think he took it to an extreme. Really, he was. I think he was one of these extravagant characters who. It definitely indulged that kind of horrific grotesquerie of overeating.
Right.
So it's just some of the things he would eat. So you find in his cookbook, and again, I must caveat I guess we'll talk about this as well. The fact that the cookbook probably wasn't written by him. It was just either piggybacking on his fame because his name became a byword for kind of grotesque gourmandery.
Yeah.
But the stuff in there like peacock tongues and flamingo tongues and kind of a proto foie gras, fig fattened pig livers, which they were fattened by stuffing the pig full of figs.
Yeah.
And all sorts of kind of omelettes involving all sorts of offal and various types of meat all shoved together.
It was all the extravagant, weird ingredients thrown all together, basically. Okay, I understand now why you call him the worst of all gourmands. I guess, was he the first? I mean, I don't think he was the first, but certainly was the first extravagant.
It's kind of... he definitely wasn't the first. There were the Romans in the 1st century BC. The Emperor Augustus had to pass a law, what was called a sumptuary law, which basically limited what people could spend on money because this kind of overeating, this exotic, extravagant dining was getting out of control. So Apicius certainly isn't the first to kind of get carried away with his eating. But he comes along at quite a interesting time when the Republic is just tipping into the empire. You got that change from the Roman Empire starts to become it's spread across the whole of the Mediterranean. It's got a huge amount of provinces under its control, and you've got the rise of the middle classes. So you've got the equestrian order, which was the second of the Roman aristocratic, the kind of lower echelons of the Roman aristocracy, with the senators as the kind of upper echelon.
The upper, yeah.
And that's kind of exactly. And that's the equestrians were kind of they were like the middle classes. They'd made their money through being merchants and bankers, and and I guess you still see this today as middle classes kind of rise up. They develop their own tastes and their own interests in things.
Certainly.
And Apicius is definitely his cookbook is kind of pitched at that level. It's probably not what the emperors were eating, and it's certainly not what the kind of Roman working classes were eating, but it's what kind of the aspiring middle classes who wanted to show off how extravagant they could be by serving up a platter of I don't know, fig fattened pig livers or peacock tongues or stuffed dormice or stuff like that.
Yeah, all that, which kind of sound like parts of a legend. Like nobody would eat that. But
well, exactly.
I think
and some of the more grotesque elements of Roman cuisine, I think there must be a bit of that about them. They, well, surely no one would go to that extent, or surely no one would go to that length to import, I don't know, 1,000 peacocks or 100,000 flamingos just to make this dish.
Yeah, exactly. So, Apicius. Tell me a little bit about. It was a real person, apparently. So, around the 1st century, right? AD.
Yeah. So he crops up in. He's one of these characters who crops up in other the kind of histories of other writers, quite often as a anecdote about how awful someone was behaving, or so he comes up. He crops up in Suetonius. Pliny the Elder mentions him, and there's a Seneca says something about him, and there's enough people that mention him that were kind of maybe near contemporaries that suggest that he existed. And he's quite often attributed to these various larger than life stories. But then there's a couple of there's a couple of Apiciuses. So there's one that crops up in about the 3rd century BC who can't be the same character, and then there's another one that comes up a bit later, and it's not entirely clear whether these were related. If the name Apicius is maybe a byword, it certainly becomes a byword for excessive consumption, and whether but the Romans had, as part of their names, the third part of the name was often a kind of honorific title. Yeah. So it could be that Apicius is, if someone has gained the name Apicius, maybe it means they are a famous gourmet. But we tend to associate the Apicius as a guy called Marcus Gaius Apicius, who lived so he's around 31 BC to about 35 AD. He lives so in that period where, like I said, the Emperor Augustus, the Emperor Tiberius, Rome's just becoming an empire
from republic, and things change a little bit. Yeah,
exactly. And so it's quite a period of change. It's a time where people could make quite a lot of money, and it's presumed that he was probably one of these people who made quite a bit of money. The two things we know about him, not to say for sure, but the two stories associated with him are the one about his death, which I mentioned already, and then there's one about how he was in possibly his home city of Minturnae, which is down towards Naples, towards modern-day Naples. Yeah. And he was feasting on prawns, and someone told him that there was even better prawns could be found off the coast of North Africa.
Yeah. Tell me about this story. Yeah, I love this story.
So he hustled down to the quayside. He commandeered a boat, probably spent vast amounts of money commandeering a boat, and sailed to North Africa, which is probably at this time, a 10 or 12-day journey in quite dangerous seas. And then he got there, harangued some local fishermen who probably brought him local prawns, and he realised that actually the prawns from back home were far better, and he ordered his captain to turn around and sail home again. And it's one of these probably apocryphal stories, but it was used by a lot of the Roman writers to illustrate what a crazy character he was. Yeah. And then he comes, and so he comes up in a number of these stories, and then quite often in quite almost always sensationalist contexts. So one of the things that happened in the Roman markets is there were quite often auctions. So in the Roman fish market, so the larger fish would be put up for auction, and the Emperor Tiberius came upon a very large mullet and put it up for auction, and he had a wager that either Apicius or one of Apicius's rivals would buy it. And he wasn't right about Apicius, but Apicius's rival did buy it. So he kind of comes up in these in the context of these stories. And then quite often it's in the context of kind of these scandalous stories, usually to do with food and overeating. But then there's a couple of times when he crops up in other scandals that aren't immediately obviously related to food. So he gets associated with Maecenas, who is one of Augustus's kind of lieutenants, who's this kind of another larger than life character who had a load of the famous poets like Virgil and Horace were his kind of students. He was their patron, and he used to wander around in his dressing gown and have long hair and generally be quite extravagant. And Apicius is said to be one of his. He had earned Maecenas' patronage. And then the other character who he's quite often associated with is Sejanus, who was for a long time was kind of almost co-regent with the Emperor Tiberius. He was quite a powerful self-made man who ended up over-scheming, and his downfall led to he got executed, his family all got executed, and Apicius comes up in relation to him that it's possibly Apicius's daughter was married to Sejanus. So again, we're not entirely sure how much of this is true and how much of this is supposition, but he's certainly in the first century at the centre of quite a rich series of noble contacts who may or may not be kind of involved in all these various very Roman scandals. But it's not entirely sure whether that's just because he's a byword for scandalous character, and by some of the Roman writers might think, well, if we just put a mention of Apicius in here, it will kind of add a bit more of a spice to this.
Exactly. Yeah. Nothing changed really the last 2,000 years.
Exactly. But he's just an interesting catch, and I found myself a bit like a archaeological detective. I'd sift through all sorts of sources, just trying to find a tantalising hint of whether he exists. I look for a mention of him here and a mention of him there.
Yeah,
and it's quite fascinating trying to put it together.
Yeah, certainly.
And obviously, one of the obvious sources was his cookbook, which again is a fantastic collection of recipes. It's the oldest. It's not the first cookbook, but it's certainly our oldest surviving cookbook.
Exactly, it's the one that survives almost intact, I guess.
Exactly.
Years ago almost.
Yeah, exactly. And there's quite a lot of recipes. I think it's about a dozen recipes in that are attributed to him. So there's they bear his. I decided, I don't know if this is true or not, but I decided the ones that bore his name were probably ones that originated with him. So there's like Miniatal, Apician style, for example, or Apician patina, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But then there's all sorts of, this is what added the element of mystery, because there's a number of recipes in there that are attributed to, so there'll be a recipe that bears the name of an emperor that lived long after Apicius died, which kind of raised the question of, well, did he actually write this cookbook? And of course, the assumption is he probably didn't. It's probably a collection of recipes that were pieced together either long after his death, or just kind of came to be by being gathered together into a single volume.
Yeah, exactly. When do we speculate that this book was written, the Apicius Cookbook?
So I think it is probably from around the 4th century. So 4th century AD. So probably about 3 or 4 centuries after Apicius died.
Exactly.
And then, but it's quite hard to tell, because the two original copies. There's 2 surviving copies, one in the Vatican Library and one in the Library in New York.
Right.
But these originate there, not kind of 9th century, so quite a long time after that.
I see. But the use of Latin in the books was vulgar Latin.
Yes. So certainly not. It's vulgar Latin, which is kind of slang Latin. It's Latin that would have been used by working classes. The sort of Latin you'd expect to be used in a kitchen in ancient Rome, but certainly not the sort of Latin you'd expect to be used by a kind of upper middle class.
Yeah, certainly a cook.
Gourmet like Apicius.
Yeah, so not a chef, not a gourmet, not a high class, but a slave cook probably in the kitchen.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one of the assumptions that one of the accepted kind of truths of the cookbook is it wasn't written by Apicius. It was written by maybe one slave, or it was from the it was adapted from the recipes of slaves, and quite possibly from a lot of slaves over the years, almost like a collection of recipes that might be passed down from one generation of chefs to the next and slowly added to, which is why it's got this kind of almost patchwork feel of, here's some recipes attributed to this person, here's some recipes in the style of this person, and then I put his name on the front.
Yeah, and exactly. You put the name in the front, and probably will sell better.
Well, exactly, especially if you're a Roman, you'll have heard of. I mean, the name Apicius.
Exactly.
Apician was, like I said, was a byword for kind of gourmandery for a long time. So, yeah, absolutely, it's like.
We don't use that term anymore, sadly. I think we use a lot of Epicurean or Lucullian, I guess.
Yeah, it's full enough. I think it lasts till maybe the end of the kind of late antiquity, I think. But yeah, it would have been comparable to Epicurean, which we of course still use today.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yes, man. So many things about Apicius.
Have you tried to cook any of his dishes?
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think a number of them are in the Classical Cookbook, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. The Classical Cookbook offers a lot of recipes from the Book of Apicius. So I've tried quite a few of them. Not obviously, I've tried them with success, let's say. Yeah, not initially, but yeah, slowly after a few times and stuff. Yeah, definitely all of them, they were successful, I think.
Which ones have you enjoyed?
Okay, so I've done the recipes for the sausages. So there is smoked sausages, Lucanicae, and another, and the white sausages. So I've done them both, and yeah, they're really tasty recipes, really good. Was it the Parthian chicken as well by Apicius?
Yeah, Parthian chicken it's in there.
There's another thing that I started doing ancient Greek and Roman dinners about 5 years ago, like a pop-up restaurant type of thing.
Okay.
And so I started doing starter, main, desserts, and so on. So one of the starters I made was with cucumber dressing, which was.
Oh yeah, I've made that.
Yeah. So my take was like, okay, we have the Greek rusk, the barley bread from antiquity. We know that. So I took the barley bread, the dried barley bread, and I used it with the cucumber dressing. And so, it soaks all the juices with the liquamen, the orgarum, with mint. I found wild meat from the mountains. I got that, the original meat, blah, 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 wine, vinegar, and so on. So it soaks, the barley rusk becomes nice and moist. You have the marinated, almost pickled kind of thing, cucumber. And then on top, I put soft goat's cheese, like fresh goat's cheese. So it's kind of like a modern take on the Cretan tacos, which is with tomato and fresh cheese, or let's say something like bruschetta, like modern day Italian bruschetta, but with cucumber and cheese. That was really successful, really popular dish.
That sounds great. And I guess it's one of that kind of speaks to the collection of recipes, I suppose, because they are so multicultural in a sense. They clearly taken, they're clearly drawing on ingredients and recipes from around the Mediterranean and beyond. And I think that sounds very in the spirit of it. Yeah,
exactly. Then I've tried a few times the salad, catabia, the chicken salad, which is a bit more complicated to serve it at 30 or 40 guests. So that's kind of...
Did you make it authentically? Did you use the
brains, the lamb's brains?
I was going to say the brains and the livers and the sweetbreads, isn't there?
Sweetbreads. Yeah, sweetbreads.
Sweetbreads.
Well, I love sweetbread, so when I do it for myself, I use that. So no problem there. But no, when I served it in restaurants, it was without the sweetbreads and the brains.
Yeah, when I cooked it, I was like I said, I can be squeamish when it comes to offal, and most of the time I applied an offal filter to Apicius's recipes. I tend to take out the offal.
And of course, almost in every event that I did, we served spiced wine, because it's been going on through the ages, actually. Throughout the whole of Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, they served spiced wine conditum paradoxum. So I used to make it for any kind of themed night, Roman or Byzantine and so on. So yeah, that was like the aperitif when the guests were coming to the dinner. Spiced wine, and it works really well with having tasty honey and mastic resin, which I can find because I can go to the local delicatessen shops, the Greek ones around London, and I can get mastic from Chios, and you have nice honey and this and that, bay leaves and black pepper, and yeah, it's beautiful. I think it's a very nice aperitif and cocktail, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it was the last thing I cooked actually, and it's the first recipe that appears in Apicius. So I think it's quite appropriate as the first thing.
And did you obviously you had the book of Apicius, right? The cookery book. Did you cook extensively almost all the recipes, or are there too many?
There are too many. I mean, the most recent translation is, I think it's 400 pages.
Oh wow! Okay. Wow. Okay.
There are. I probably did count them. I'll tell you afterwards how many there were. But there are. I think there's well over there's a few hundred. I think recipes in there. So it's certainly too much.
That's too much. Yeah.
Yeah. I tended to focus. I needed a method in terms of how to. So partly I'd use, because I was trying to tell his story as well. I'd find recipes that seemed to fit parts of his story. So the spiced wine surprise that you just mentioned, I thought fitted with the end, kind of the end of his life.
Yeah.
There's a quite a sentimental recipe. In fact, it's the only recipe that has what might be described as kind of a, in the same way that a modern cookbook might have a bit of a kind of description to start with, which maybe adds a bit of an emotion or empathy or kind of explanation as to why it's being cooked. The only recipe that really does that is one for bulbs, which talks about serving them if you're seeking the harbour of Venus, which makes me kind of think it was done possibly for it was possibly a recipe associated with marriage or courtship or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was. I mean, the way you described the recipe on your thesis, it was quite intriguing, basically. So you cooked it, and there was something missing, and then you put it in the oven and roasted.
Yeah,
and then it all came together.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I used shallots. I think it was because again, it's one of the things you'll quickly realise if you go to the original recipes of Apicius, is they're very vague. I'm sure you found this. There's certainly no measurements and no cooking times, and quite often not really a full ingredients list. So, for example, the recipe for bulbs, I mean, it's just called bulbs, but it says boil the bulbs, and it doesn't say what sort of bulb.
Right.
I kind of assumed the Romans ate quite a lot of different edible bulbs, like edible hyacinth bulbs and that sort of thing. But for a lot of the times, I think you're probably a bit more dedicated than I am, but a lot of the times I was either pressed for time or circumstance in Norwich, I guess, and I'd have to make do. So part of the fun was trying to work out in what way which corners to cut, which substitutes to make. So I ended up, I think I used shallots in the end for that one. But it was this very tasty recipe in the end. It's kind of involved boiling these shallots up with all sorts of different honey and vinegar and obviously garum and spices. But it came out as this kind of quite gloopy mess. And then, as you said, I put it in I think I was making one of the roast pork dinners as well, dishes at the same time, and I just put it in the oven, and it kind of came together. And I kind of wonder if that's almost how the cookbook was meant to be used. It was kind of like a list of suggestions and guidances from like one expert to another. So if you were a Roman chef or a Roman cook with this cookbook, you'd obviously fill in the gaps yourself, or you'd go, well, of course this needs to go in the oven, or of course I'll use these shallots instead of these hyacinth bulbs.
Yeah, certainly. I think that sounds plausible, and
and then the other thing I did to kind of whittle down which recipes to go for. So the ones not necessarily the ones that told a story, but with the ones named after him, because like I said, there's only about a dozen that have his name, and I kind of thought, well, that seems as good a way as any to to pick, because it's from that gives you quite a good slice through the cookbook. So you've got things like Epician conchicla, which is some sort of, it's like a dish involving pork and peas. I mean, there's about 3 different types, and lucanicae and pork meatballs, and that was quite a good introductory dish for me. And then you've got things like the patina, the minital, which is like a stew.
Yes.
And I mean, again, I was leaving out the testicles and the sweet. So Sainsbury's didn't have.
Strange that.
I know, exactly.
Yeah, my Sainsbury's doesn't have it either. So, but yeah, you're mentioning the pork and the peas. I mean, to anybody that cooked once or twice in their life, I mean, it sounds like a great combination already. Peas and pork. I mean, we have something similar nowadays, like pea and ham soup, for example. So it doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be too alien, really, does it?
And I think it helps that there's so many recipes to choose from that you can. There's a lot. I mean, like I said, there's a lot that's unfamiliar as soon as if you're used to a modern recipe when you see these ancient recipes. But then there's a lot of familiar things like the pork and peas. It's cooking peas in a saucepan with a couple of different types of ham, with some spices, most of which are familiar. I mean, it's ground pepper, it's oregano, it's dill, it's coriander, it's all stuff that we would. I mean, it's only occasionally you have to go out of your comfort zone and get mastic, for example, or lovage, or stuff like that.
Yeah, lovage is the one that it's difficult to find the seeds.
Although celery seeds is apparently quite similar. That's what I ended up using as a substitute quite a lot of the time.
Good tip. Yeah, I'm using celery seeds sometimes, but I'm growing lavage in my garden, so I'm going to that length.
But then stuff like the garum, and I think you've talked about this before. The kind of the Thai fish sauce is probably not exactly the same, but is passable. It adds the same kind of umami texture that I imagine you'd have got from the Roman equivalent.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a whole episode about garum, which covers all the possibilities and all the ways that whatever the archaeologists and the food historians, found and they came up with, and obviously what we know from the modern Thai fish sauce and Vietnamese fish sauce, and also I think Sally Granger did more in depth, trying to find out about garum more and all that stuff. So yeah, I was based a lot on her research about garum and how it's familiar to the modern fish sauce and so on, and also the restaurant Noma in Denmark, one of maybe the best restaurant in the world apparently. They do a lot of different garums. So they have a book about fermentation, and in the book about fermentation they have about 10 recipes of garum, how to make your own garum at home, and fish garum and shrimp garum and even meat garum, and they've gone to other extreme lengths of of making this fermented.
Did you have a go? Did you try and ferment your own garum?
I haven't yet.
That was where I drew the line as well. Offal and making my own garum. I thought it might test the bounds of my relationship a little bit too much.
Yeah,
because I mean, I was forcing my partner to eat a lot of this Roman cooking, and he's sometimes suspicious on the best of times of my cuisine. Yes,
that's probably.
You can imagine the comments from the neighbours if you had all the fermenting fish guts out in the back garden.
Oh God, yes. I'm looking forward to it actually. I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one of my regrets. Is I didn't really get a chance to delve into Roman bread. I think that would be there's quite a few recipes. I don't think there's not really any recipes in Apicius for bread beyond the flat bread. That I think it's used on one occasion, but there certainly are recipes for Roman bread floating around that I'd have loved to have tried out as part of this project, but I never got around to. I think possibly want to come back to.
Yeah. I think I definitely haven't done enough with Roman breads or ancient.
It's the whole episode there, maybe ancient breads.
Yeah. I think not only episode. Yeah, I want to actually do some, different recipes, experiment with different yeasts. Like I think they used a lot of wine yeasts or grape yeasts. Yeah, which was obviously more easily available in a way. So much wine.
Yeah, I think a lot of the you can see that in some of the recipes. A lot of it is obviously byproducts of various things. I think a lot of the sauces. One of the things Apicius is famous for is his sauces, although it's not entirely in evidence in the actual cookbook. But I think a lot of that was sauces that would then go with leftover meat. So they might, if they've done a big, I guess like we do today, if you've done a big pork roast, for example, you'll have a lot of leftovers. So it's then maybe sauces that are used with the leftovers. Yeah. So I mean, that's one of the two things that I think it was Appian, one of the later writers, kind of comments that he's famous for is sauces and cakes, both of which are kind of lacking actually in his cookbook. Certainly cakes. Apparently he was famous for his cheesecakes, and unfortunately we don't have a recipe for cheesecakes. But I used I made a couple of his sauces. So I was trying to cook mullet, because obviously in homage to his the kind of story about him bidding
in
for
the fish market.
In the fish market, exactly. Yeah. And there's not so many recipes for mullet, but there are recipes for sauces to go with mullet. And one of the ones I made was a dill sauce, which is quite tasty actually. It was just kind of pepper, which seems to be in all the cookbook, in all the recipes in Apicius. There's a lot of pepper involved. I think it was quite a new ingredient at the time. It was quite fashionable.
Yeah.
So there's pepper, there's dill seeds, there's oil and vinegar and wine, and then a little bit of garum, of course. And that's just, again, it's just quite a simple combination of ingredients. That's a familiar. We've all cooked. We've all prepared kind of dressings and sauces like that. That's so that was one of the ones I quite liked. That was quite tasty, especially with the mullet.
Yeah.
And then there's the other one I made was one that went with one of his pork dishes, which is called ophilae, which kind of means small pieces of meat.
Okay.
So it's probably a pork belly. I think I used a pork belly, and it's dry roasted, and then put in the oven. And then the sauce is made out of again pepper, lovage, cumin. Again, cumin comes up in a lot of these recipes, and then liguamin, and then wine or more garum was added. And then again, it was quite a tasty combination of ingredients. And then the meat was chopped up once it had roasted, or kind of almost like pulled pork, I think, or slightly kind of sliced into cubes. And then it was all mixed up in this sauce, and that was quite a tasty one as well. It's not quite made the cut in our household as something I cook regularly, but it's the sort of thing I could imagine cooking.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's always quite interesting. I suspect I don't know if you found this when you were trying the garum out and cooking the garum. Quite often when you're cooking with the garum, it creates this horrendous stench when you put it in like a hot pan.
Yeah.
And it quite overwhelms the kitchen quite literally in terms of the smell.
Absolutely.
To the point where you're like, I'm not entirely sure I want to eat this. But then when it comes together with a lot of the ingredients, it just adds this really subtle undercurrent of flavour, which I found that was one of the more interesting things with a lot of the sauces in Apicius was kind of this, just the flavour combination was interesting in a good way. I don't think I cooked anything that was horrible. Great. It was all surprisingly tasty, which I probably shouldn't be surprised at. But
well, no, I mean it's a period of 2,000 years afterwards, so tastes and the taste buds change, and people the way they cook and they eat change. So yeah, I mean it could have been completely and utterly repulsive, but it hasn't been, and I think it's kind of surprising in a way.
Yeah, it's always a pleasant surprise. I mean, it probably helps that I had this. I was quite self-selecting in terms of what I cooked. I wasn't setting out to cook everything, so obviously I was picking things that looked quite nice. I wasn't the ones with the brain, the pig brains. I left them to the side, for example. So there was a certain element of, I'd introduced a bias that I was probably going to be picking ingredients that sounded tasty, like the roast pork and sauce. That sounds delicious already. Yes. There was more chance that it was going to be tasty than perhaps if you'd set out to cook everything, which I suspect you might come across a few dishes that you probably would make your stomach turn, or might involve literally stomach.
I am a very adventurous person in terms of cooking and eating, so I like most of the things. Yeah, go on about the patina pisciana.
Well, I mean, So, I mean, a normal patina, I guess they're probably one of the more popular dishes given how many recipes there are for them. And they tend to be like a pan of meat or a pan of vegetables, and then you seem to break the eggs into it and kind of cook it up a bit like an omelette, a bit like a custard. But then the Apician patina, it's something else entirely. I think it definitely involves these a large amount of meat. It uses cooked udder, it uses fish, chicken, fig peckers, which I think are some sort of like a thrush, like a little bird or something, probably cooked whole, pretty cooked whole, I guess. And these are all diced up, and then there's all sorts of spices go in there, and then there's eggs, of course, as well. But then the interesting thing about this is it's after you've cooked all this chopped meat up, and it's layered up in a dish with flatbreads on top between the layers, and it's so much like a lasagna. I mean, apart from possibly the cooked udder and flaked fish, but in kind of concept, this creating this dish of layers, and I mean, doubly so when you realise that the word for these flatbreads is lagana, which just I don't know enough about the history of pasta to know if this is kind of predecessor, an ancestor of lasagna, but it certainly looks like it is in terms of the concept.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it kind of almost makes you think that there were things similar to pasta before. So yeah, I think that there was an element that I think ancient Greeks and ancient Romans had, that pasta type of things, proto-pasta, and I think it was also invented in China with noodles. So I think we had two different parts of the world that invented this thing.
Kind of parallel evolution. Kind of.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the Apician patina is one of my regrets. That's one of the ones that got away that I didn't get around to cooking. Just because it's quite it's one of the ambitious recipes in there, I think. One of the higher ability ones, I'd have thought.
Yeah, definitely. I think we should try it soon then.
Yes, maybe next time if you do another one of your Roman cookery evenings.
Yeah. I'll have the patina Apiciana in your honor.
Possibly.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting. I always think I mean, Roman cuisine is such a big topic anyway, isn't it? That this is very much, we're talking about Apician Roman cuisine. It's through that kind of upper middle class aspirational lens, which probably, I suspect, doesn't bear much relation to Roman cuisine in general. But it's certainly, because it's the cookbook that survived, it's the one we end up looking at. There is a cookbook called Roman Cookery, who I can't remember who that's by, Mark. Oh, sorry, I've left it across the other side of the room. But that tries to get to Roman cookery beyond Apicius. But I think it's such a fascinating topic, and I think people nowadays are quite experimental when it comes to cooking. I think people are a lot more interested in food in general and trying things out than maybe they used to be. And as well, people are quite interested in the ancient world. I think it's quite a good time for people to be trying to experiment with ancient recipes and ancient cuisine. And because we have so much, so many of Apicius's recipes survive, and as a result have been studied and interpreted primarily by Sally Granger, it's quite an easy, if people do want to just try cooking Roman food or one type of Roman food, I think there's worse places to start than Apicius. Maybe don't start with the Apician patina, but
yeah, there are plenty of other simpler recipes and accessible, and also the ingredients, you can find them nowadays.
Especially not. You don't even have to go as far as like a deli or a specialist cook shop. A lot of most of the ingredients I found quite happily in Sainsbury's or the local supermarket. It was I did not have to go particularly out of my way to find this stuff, and you have to be quite flexible when it comes to if you're using the original ingredient recipe in terms of guessing in what quantities. But like I said, Sally Granger has done a fantastic job in a couple of cookbooks now of distilling it down and working out through experimentation how much of stuff to use, and even the utensils and equipment used is it's stuff you have in your kitchen already. Obviously, the Romans wouldn't have used a fan oven, but
No.
there's they'd have probably had an oven in some capacity or something that would that will lead to the same end result as stick it in the oven for half an hour.
Yeah. I think they did I think it was the ancient Greeks that they invented the oven as we know it, with a closed door and so on. So I'm sure they would have, the Romans took the concept further and improved it, and for sure they would have plenty. Not every household, obviously, it's something very expensive and very energy consuming, but definitely you would have markets and outdoor food stalls and this kind of places that there will be plenty of ovens for cooking. For masses basically. So I think it's not a million miles away. Most of the stuff that we can do nowadays, and compare it to what they did 2,000 years ago. And if you go to the British Museum and see the treasures from different parts of the Roman Britain, and you can see their kitchen utensils and you see what they used and all the tableware and cookware, and almost all of them, they have something familiar, something that fundamentally hasn't changed, really.
Yeah, and even I suspect, again, you could probably have a whole episode on Roman dining and Roman dining rooms and dining culture, but fundamentally, part of the fact that they're lying on their fronts, on their sides to eat, the concept of a 3-course meal is very familiar to us. The kind of the sort of dinner which comes with many different dishes is familiar to us. It might not be how we eat every night, but it's certainly, if you go to out for tapas or for Chinese, the concept of having lots of dishes with lots of different food stuff, sort of kind of concoctions.
Yeah,
that's quite a familiar concept to us. That's not an alien thing. That's it's familiar.
Exactly. Yeah.
If you kind of turned up at a Roman dining table, you would know what to do. Possibly, mostly.
I suppose they had different names. What was the name for the first course?
Off the top of my head.
Gustachio.
Yeah, gustachio. Yeah,
Gustachio. And then the main course
is mensa primae.
Mensa primae.
Yeah, and then mensa secundae, which was the kind of desserts. So it's as you'd expect. Gustachio is the the first course, and that's the appetizers, the start of the kind of stuff to cleanse and stimulate your palate, to kind of whet your appetite. And the main course, the mensae primae is that's the main course. That's what you'd expect to get your vegetables and your meat and your fish and all sorts of things. And then the mensae secundae is your dessert. It's again quite familiar. There's something familiar about that as a concept.
Yeah, very familiar. Yeah, exactly. Everything sounds quite modern in a way.
And I don't know how much that is us projecting. It's recognizable to us, so therefore we're kind of homing in on the recognizable stuff and ignoring the stuff that's not familiar, like the dining couches or the.
Yeah, true. Or the watered down wine. I guess that's another thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose. I haven't tried that one. I guess in that respect, I'm barbarian.
You'd be considered a barbarian, I think, wouldn't you? You'd drink your wine neat, unmixed.
But on my defense, I have always a glass of water next to my glass of wine. So
there you go. It's like the spiritual successor.
Yeah. In terms, I'm reading now that diced watermelon dressed with mint and pieces of cheese and bread. I mean, that's something like you'll find as an entree in a canapé, in a modern table, really. Watermelon meat, perfect. It sounds modern.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some of the ones. There's a recipe for it's like eggs. It's a bit like deviled eggs.
Deviled eggs, exactly.
There's very similar things that we use as starters.
I love it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I find it so fascinating.
I always think it's quite interesting. I've been to a couple of there's a couple of places I've seen. I've never been to one yet. It's one of my goals. And there's a couple of restaurants named Apicius, both in this country and in Italy, and actually in Tokyo. I've happened to walk past them.
Really?
I always think that's quite interesting that there's still that kind of legacy of, even though we might not use the word Apician anymore, there's still that that concept that Apicius was this gourmand, this kind of grand ancestor of haute cuisine that still lives with us, even though it's ever so slightly in the names of a few restaurants here and there. I always find that quite interesting. I always think it was a later Roman writer, Tertullian, refers to Apicius as the patron saint of cooks, and I always think that's quite a nice way of thinking about him. Possibly, even if he, for whatever we don't know about him, there's certainly enough smoke. There must be there must be enough fire of that he must in some way have been involved in cookery or gastronomy or cuisine in some fashion for his name to become attached to the cookbook, and then to have it this reputation that's survived 2,000 years.
Yeah, exactly.
I could talk about Apicius for great lengths of time. I find him quite an interesting character, and the Roman cuisine I just find it's just interesting. It's one of my kind of pet projects, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things, obviously, they had different kinds of vegetables. Obviously, they had onions, but as you said, they had lots of different edible bulbs. You said,
yeah.
What else?
Hyacinth.
Hyacinth. Yeah. What else did they have? Have you found out really any other interesting edible bulbs that they had?
Yeah. So they ate all sorts of bulbs really. So quite a few of the flowering bulbs that we would obviously we wouldn't eat anymore. So the bulbs of the lily and the squill. Do you think so?
Yeah.
Which certainly in some varieties are edible. I don't want to say that all lily bulbs are edible, but and then of course they still they'd use like garlic bulbs. I think would still crop up in Roman cooking, I think. And then the grape hyacinth is the type of bulb that gets that they consider an aphrodisiac, which I think is why it was probably the bulb used in the recipe for bulbs I mentioned earlier, which talks about Venus. Yeah. And they're actually still the grape hyacinth is still used in. It comes up as part of meze in southern Italy and Greece. I think it's is it Volvae? I think in Greece, I think it's called.
Yes.
And Lampascioni, I think, is in southern Italy.
Yeah. You see, you forget these things because obviously I've lived here for so long, and yeah, of course, yeah. Now you mention it, I think they had parsnips, right? Parsnips, which I don't think we eat nowadays in Greece, or I don't think I've seen them in Italy either.
No, it's not. You don't tend to associate it, do you, with Mediterranean cuisine? Yeah. Certainly, I think of parsnips as kind of hearty northern dishes, and I think parsnips were they were imported from Germany originally. I think.
Right.
I think it's one of the Tiberius, the second emperor Tiberius, imported parsnips.
It was his luxury or something. Yeah.
I mean, some of his luxuries leave a lot to be desired, but he had a thing for cucumbers as well, I think. And then carrots were used, but only modern carrots are orange. I think in Roman days, carrots would have been purple, or a variety of colours, but they'd have associated purple.
Right.
Purple carrots as when you think of a carrot. But yeah, they had a huge range of vegetables, some of which we still recognise and some we probably wouldn't.
Yeah.
Just because tastes change, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's another interesting thing that I find with ancient Roman and Greek cuisine, that you have all these things that they fell out of fashion and then they crop up somewhere else, and then maybe there's a little local place that they still do it, but you haven't heard of, and then somebody else says, "Oh yeah, but it's still going on."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, of course.
Did you find with Lucanicae, for example? Did you? Because that crops up in Apicius quite a few times. Did you find they were quite familiar because you made them, didn't you? And...
Yeah. Not all the ingredients, but certainly the use of leek and pepper was extremely familiar. Something that it was part of most of the sausages that I eat from Greece, or when we do it in Greece, the traditional village sausages that are with leek, black pepper, pork meat, and smoked or cured for a few days and so on. So that was very, very familiar. It was something that it wouldn't be out of place in some small village in Greece or southern Italy for that matter.
Yeah, one of probably the most extreme lengths I went to for when I was researching this project was I did a butchery course.
Right.
With a local kind of butchers and charcuterie in Norfolk. So I learned how to make sausages from scratch, but also how to properly carve up a pig and all sorts of things like that. Which was there's some, I don't know. There's some. It's one of the reasons I wouldn't necessarily advocate going to that length, but there's something about actually getting hands on with the recipes that I think lets you understand the kind of mindset.
Right.
The people that have written them, the people that were eating them, just because there's an awful lot of difference between us and people that lived 2,000 years ago. But when you're in the kitchen, you're cooking things largely in the same way. You're carving meat or you're preparing meat. It's fundamentally unchanged on a certain level than it was 2,000 years ago. We're still eating with the same. I know we said tastes have changed, but we're fundamentally eating with the same equipment, quite literally with our tongues, with our taste buds. That when the recipe's asking for pepper and cumin and parsley and bay leaf and all that sort of stuff, I think it connects us on that kind of across time, because we're experiencing the same thing as they were experiencing, and there's not many things that you can do that with.
No, for sure.
Studying the ancients.
I agree with that totally. I think that's the most fascinating thing, I guess, from studying these recipes and actually cooking them. It connects you with the past totally. It's like a time machine. I don't think there's another equivalent that takes you so close to the ancient past.
No, definitely not, because that experience is their experience is so far removed from ours on so many different levels. There's so many different assumptions and contexts that we don't have that they would have had. But even going to ancient Rome or to like a Roman site is so different than we can't assume that they would have experienced it in the same way that we do, because it's such a long time ago.
Yeah.
But with food, I think it does act as a bridge. It's I think you're right, it's one of the only things that does connect us so closely in such a in such an intimate way.
Exactly, yeah, as you say, intimate way, yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining.
That's okay. Thanks for having me.
I hope you're keeping well and staying safe at home.
Yes, mostly spending time in my kitchen, baking and cooking, actually.
Excellent.
Seems appropriate.
Yeah. I think everybody does that now. What else can you do?
Absolutely.
Apart from obviously doing a podcast about food.
Yeah, when we're not cooking food, we're talking about food.
Have a lovely evening.
Yes, you too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me on.
You're welcome.
It was good to talk.
Yes,
exactly.
Podcast
as well. It's always it's a highlight of my podcast diary.
Great. Okay. Have a lovely evening. See you.
I'll speak to you
Confusion.
again soon.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
And that's all for this week's episodes. Thank you for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and see you in 2 weeks' time. Goodbye. Remember, if you want exclusive content, the podcast episodes earlier, and ad-free, join me on Patreon under the Delicious Legacy name. Here, for just $3 per month, you can have all the above. This way, you'll help me create the episodes faster, release them quicker, and concentrate more on researching other interesting subjects from the ancient world. Additionally, you will get straight to your inbox lots of exclusive material, such as recipes, images, and other tailor-made content. Here, I would like to extend my gratitude to my patrons so far: Andrew Price, Damian Bell, Deborah Wilson, Paul M.M. Cooper, Greg Duncan, Mark Knight, Tom Eagle, Pauline Morgan, and Rachel Marshall. Thank you all for your patronage, and I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.